Again, welcome. My name is Lauren Scott. I'm with the CE Program Management Office, and we have our second presenter, which is Mr. Bob Bowles from Regis University, and he will be presenting on access control recommendations. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Hi, everybody. Before I get into my presentation, I just wanted to add a little contribution for the last discussion because I thought it was so fascinating. Dr. Nobles did an outstanding job, and I thought the discussion was just awesome. And then I think there was one lady who was talking about doing her dissertation. So I would like to throw this out just for some food for thought on this. There's a lot talking about the insider threat. And, you know, for 40 years, I've been hearing that the greatest threat against an organization is the insider threat. And I agree, but I'd just like to throw this out there for some food for thought. And you don't have to comment or anything, but just kind of process this a little bit. I was involved with the federal government at that time for about, I don't know, probably 25 years. And I got the dot-com fever. Some of you remember this back in the 2000 era, 2001 area. A friend of mine got $8 million of venture capital and basically said, come on, Bob, let's go out and start a business and let's build some security products. You know, we'll be the envy of the industry with our products. Hopefully somebody will buy us out and we'll cash in our chips and go live in the Caribbean somewhere. Well, you can see how that worked out. But during that process, I learned a lot of things from the startup. And one of the things that we did while we were building our tools, we would offer vulnerability assessments to our clients to help reduce our burn rate and reduce our cost. And those vulnerability assessments, the way that we would do them, some of you would refer to us as a red team, where we would go in and we would, you know, first of all, ask our clients, we'd have a contract with them, have their permission, so we were white hat hackers. But what we would do is we would go in and we would tell them, okay, give us your IP addresses of the servers, switches, routers, any particular sensitive boxes that you do not want us to touch, because if we were to touch them at the time, it may affect your operations in a negative way. And then we would begin our attack. And what we would do is we would attack the organization. And then after we would attack them, we would then have what we call, a hot wash or a after wash, so to speak, or a blue team come in. And then we would help them tighten up their controls to make sure that they would not be vulnerable to those types of attacks in the future. And some people say, well, Bob, that's completely opposite of the way we do things. And I agree. But the thought that we were taking is a hacker's not going to call you up and say, at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to attack you. They come in and they make their attack, and then either you're prepared or you aren't. So what we would do is we would attack first and then help the organizations, our clients at that time, to strengthen their organization, strengthen their security postures by what they learned from the attack. And I'll give an example. And this, again, this is for some food for thought. I want to talk about two things here. One is on the insider threat. I'll give you one strategy that we used to use. And it's been a while, obviously, since I've been actively practicing in the industry, but I'll just give you an example. What we would do is many times when we were doing one of these vulnerability assessments, we would attack the operating systems. In other words, and starting at the firewalls. So for example, if you think about the OSI model, you've got the operating system, and then on top of that, you've got an application running. And I'll just use an example of a Cisco PIX at that time. But what we would do is we would go in and we would go in at the operating system, find a vulnerability at the operating system, and not, you know, these were not sophisticated tools that we were using. I guess you could call us script kiddies. We would basically find, at that time, go up to one of the 93,000 hacker sites that were out there, and we would download a tool that had already been created by the attackers and just launch it against a particular organization. But one of the things that we would do is we would attack at the firewall level at the operating system, in this case, the Cisco iOS, because at that time, and I think it still stands true today, Many organizations do not patch their operating systems like they should, in a timely manner, I should say. So what we would do is we would go in at the operating system, install a sniffer, look for administrative passwords, administrative credentials, capture that, change the password on those credentials, and basically lock the administrators out of their own network. And I've seen this happen. We have owned networks in as little as 5 minutes. So we would go in and do that. And here's what the big thought I want you to take away from this, just to think about. We would go in from the outside. So the attack started from the external side. We would come in through the operating system, install a sniffer, capture someone's user credentials, for example, go back out and then patch the hole that we found on the way in to basically eliminate any trace that we were ever there. And say, for example, in a real world situation, I could then log on, or let's say I'll just pick somebody here. I'll pick on Lauren. I could disguise myself as Lauren, log on because the system would authenticate me because I've got her user ID and password, all of her credentials. Log on later on, and then the next morning, Lauren comes into work and she's brought in on the red carpet, questioning Lauren, what were you doing snooping around in the payroll files last night at 2 a.m.? And Lauren's response would be, what do you mean 2 a.m.? I didn't even know there was a 2 a.m. I was asleep at 2 a.m. But the fact of it is, all the evidence would point that this was an insider attack or an insider doing something that he should not be doing, when in fact it was an external attack that disguised itself as an internal attack. So just something to think about when you hear the term about insider attacks, which again, I agree that it is the greatest threat, but there might be situations where it's not really an insider attack. It's actually an external attack disguised as an internal attack. So kind of the old saying is the first report is always not the final report. Just kind of keep that in mind, just some food for thought. And then to the lady, I apologize, I didn't capture her name, who was doing her thesis. I totally agree. I think our next attack is going to be a cyber attack. I've been warning my students about this for years now. But I'll just give you some statistics. When I was a CISO at the Department of the Interior, we found on average at that time that a breach would cost us, like a single breach, it doesn't even have to be a breach, it could be an unauthorized disclosure. But a single user's account who got maybe compromised, that could cost us about $20,000. And what we found out that, for example, and there's all kinds of studies that show this, but if, for example, if you're a victim of identity theft, on average, it costs you about $25,000 to get your identity reinstated and get all the damage, control that needs to be done. About $25,000 in about 6 months. And to the lady's point about her thesis about the next attack, I think about the Equifax attack, and just bear with me for a second here, just in the raw numbers, because there's roughly 350 million people in the United States right now. And on the Equifax attack alone, 145 million accounts were compromised. And I realize a lot of them are children, and I get that. But just for the conversation, if you look at that, then approximately 40–45% of the entire U.S. population was affected by that attack. And so if you take that particular incident, just that one incident, and you look at, okay, if identity theft, if let's say a foreign entity was to launch a major identity theft attack against the United States because they've got this many records, social security numbers, names, addresses, phone numbers, you name it. If they were to launch an attack like that, if you take the statistic that on average it costs $25,000 to get your identity reinstated in 6 months, think about the financial and the economic harm that it would do to the United States if an attack like that was launched. It would literally cripple us for at least 6 months. When you think about half of the US population's could not apply for credit, cannot use credit cards, cannot do anything financially because their identity had been compromised. While it takes all the protection agencies such as LifeLock, Identity Guard, others to try to straighten that out, it would be a real mess. So I always try to express to my students that when you're looking at something, don't just look at the first order of effect, look at the second and the third order of effect. Try to see that big picture of what could be brewing on the horizon, what could be coming down the pipe. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is I thought what Calvin brought out was incredible in terms of the intellectual motivation, the human factor, and then also about what this lady who's conducting her dissertation on her studies on. I think both of these folks are right on target. So with that, let me go ahead and get into my presentation now. First of all, I'd just like to say I'm thoroughly impressed with this audience. I mean, the level of education here just blows me away. Just to give you a little something about myself, let me introduce myself here. And the purpose of this presentation is I just want to provide a method, one method, and there are many methods, but one method that I used when I was an information assurance manager and a CISO to basically enforce our access controls. Okay, so it's a simplified, practical approach, and hopefully you will be able to take away something from this that will maybe help you with your businesses or your organizations, or even that you could provide to your students. So first, let me tell you a little something about our university. I'm Bob Bowles, as Lauren introduced, from Regis University. And our college is the College of Anderson College of Business and Computing. And I'm proud to say that we were the first in Colorado at that time, in 2007, to receive our Center of Academic Excellence. And like many of you right now, probably on the call, we're in the process of performing our redesignation right now. We offer two specializations in our programs. One is in cybersecurity, Master's in Information and Cybersecurity, which we call our MS ICS program, and another Master's in Cybersecurity that we offer is a specialization, which is Policy Management. We offer two cybersecurity certificates. One, as the name it says itself, a cybersecurity certificate, and another cybersecurity certificate in Policy Management. And then we've got one on the board right now. It's in the final process of going through our academic councils and our Board of Trustees for approval, and that is the Cybersecurity Essentials Certificate. And what we have found, and some of you may be experiencing this in your universities as well, as Dr. Noble was talking about, our landscape is constantly changing. And what we're finding now is that we're seeing, I won't say a percentage because I don't have that data, but we know that there's a certain amount of students who are not wanting to follow the traditional educational route. In other words, they want to go down, they want to get a couple of certificates, take it down to a potential employer and say, look, I've proven I've got the technical aptitude for this, so I'd like to have an entry-level position in your organization. And a lot of companies are doing that. They're bringing in these employees like that. They're then training them into particular positions that they want for them in cybersecurity or their methodology as a culture in cybersecurity. And then they send them back to a university to complete either their undergraduate or master's in cybersecurity. Another thing we're seeing is a lot of folks that are changing industries. One industry we see is healthcare, which is kind of interesting because healthcare is one of the largest industries in demand right now, but yet there's some folks that are leaving because particularly of COVID and the experience they've been in the last 2 years. They're burnt out, as Dr. Nobles was talking about in his presentation. They feel like they've been put at risk health-wise. They're putting their families at risk. So they rather have a more, I guess, less, what can I say, a less intrusive type program or a career, so that they're not feeling that they're putting their personal health at risk. And then obviously we've got a lot of here in the Denver area, a lot of military in the Denver area, down all along the Front Range, particularly Colorado Springs. A lot of folks, they come to Colorado Springs and it may be their last tour of duty, and they are exiting what we call, ETSing for those of you that are not familiar with it, but they're departing from the military, looking for a new career. They're very young men and women, some of them in their late 30s, early 40s. So they're getting ready to start a new career and they're looking for some new career to get into. So that's where we find a lot of our students are coming from. And during this process, the two certificates that we offer, the one in cybersecurity and the other one in policy management, they were geared for career enhancers. In other words, for those students that are in the industry, they're trying to get a certificate to maybe get a promotion, enhance their career. And so we saw that there was a need for students that are coming into the industry that do not have any cybersecurity experience or maybe even IT experience. So this certificate is to offer them, someone coming into the industry, to more or less test the waters. Is cybersecurity a good fit for us? And if it is, great. I get the certificate. They love it. We've got several courses or 4 courses that actually gives them a good overall view of the program itself, in terms of touching, like getting some IT concepts under their belt, some forensic skills under their belt, some tools that we use in cybersecurity, and then also how to kind of manage a secure enterprise to give them the 50,000 foot or the big picture on this. And that our hopes is that this will open up some opportunities for particularly maybe some disadvantaged students or students that are wanting to change careers, to open the door for them into many of the open positions right now. I know if some of you are checking, there's like 597,000 unfilled cybersecurity positions in the US alone. We have 23,000 in Colorado. And most of those actually are in the Denver local community right now. And then lastly, about our program, I'm proud to say we've been hosting for 12 consecutive years now the Rocky Mountain Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. And right now we're getting ready to prepare for our qualifying round. We've got 13 universities now that are competing. And out of those 13 universities, they will compete on the 26th of February. The top 8 teams will compete for the Rocky Mountain area or the Rocky Mountain Region Championship. And then the winner of that team will advance on to the national competition. And what this does, this allows the universities that are competing in our region to basically test the strength of their cybersecurity program. How are we doing based on how we competed with some of the other top cybersecurity students in the industry, at least in the Rocky Mountain area. And we feel like this is our way of, part of our mission of giving back, pushing people up, helping people, and it helps start some of these young men and women's cybersecurity careers. So we're very, very pleased about that. All right, so again, my name is Bob Bowles. I was the Department of the Army Civilian for 32 years. I served 6 years active duty in the Army, 5 years in the reserves. When I was in the reserves, I got activated for Desert Shield, Desert Storm. After that tour, I decided, okay, I think I've had enough of being in the military. And then, but I stayed associated with the military as the Department of the Army civilian. And then after 32 years, I moved over to the Department of the Interior, spent 8 years with them, in which I retired in 2016. At that time, I was teaching all along with Regis University as an affiliate faculty. And then for the last 2.5 years, I came on as a ranked faculty and took over as the director for the Center for Information Assurance Studies. So again, this process that I'm about to talk about is what I feel is a practical way. We talk about security as an art and a science. I don't know if I would describe my process as an art, so to speak, but it did work for me for over 30 years. During that 30-year period, I only had one security incident, and that incident was caused basically by a developmental flaw in the application that we were using. When any kind of sensitive information was leaving the organization, if it wasn't encrypted, it was supposed to be quarantined, and then that way one of our analysts could look at it and determine if it was a true positive or a false positive. But unfortunately, this design flaw was that if any kind of sensitive information was leaving the organization, instead of designed to close or to fail shut, it failed open. And thus we had our first incident, my only incident that happened. So very powerful lesson learned. So I will talk about access controls here now. And in my opinion, you know, as Calvin was talking about the human factor and stuff, I always felt that there is two absolutes in cybersecurity at which you cannot bend on. Okay, and I know that one of them, again, some of you will disagree, and I'm fine, because the cybersecurity, I guess, culture, those that are in the industry, there's a debate on this, and there's a division about it, and there always will be. But number one, I believe you must have an enforceable security policy and controls. If you don't have an enforceable security policy, you don't have a policy. I mean, that's my simplistic mind and way of looking at things. You can't, if you don't have an enforceable security policy, or you can't enforce a security policy, there is no way that you can guarantee what's going on in your organization. So if, like the old song, you're just wishing and hoping and praying and thinking, that's what's happening, at least in my opinion. The other thing is, I would never allow split tunneling. Split tunneling, in my opinion, the risk far outweighs the benefits that you get from that. And I've heard every excuse under the sun, and some of you say, you know, Bob, I use split tunneling and don't have a problem with it. I hear you. I'm just saying I'm in the camp that believes it's both of these other words. If you don't have a forcible security policy, or if you allow split tunneling, you have unacceptable risk in your environment. And that's outside of the scope of this, but the enforceable part is what we're talking about in terms of the access controls. Okay, so, you know, I think a lot of times many vendors are selling us tools and applications to secure our enterprise, and that's a good thing. But I believe sometimes that we're looking for the silver bullet to basically kill the vampire, so to speak, and it really doesn't exist. For years, there's been an associate that I've been dealing with over the years, and she's been after me, Bob, we need to write a book. And she is one of the most smartest ladies I've met in cybersecurity. And she's traveled all over the world, you know, learning processes and things that other organizations use. But I always felt like she was looking after this silver bullet, you know, looking for an application, one solution solves all type thing. And I kept telling her, you know, I can't agree with that, because most of the organizations, we don't practice the basics. We don't practice those foundational truths that we use day in and day out from an operational perspective to secure our enterprise. So if we're not using those foundational truths, then we're never going to be able to use some of the most advanced tools and technologies that we have, or practices. And secondly, you got to be diligent and persistent day in and day out. The minute you leave your, you know, you let your guard down, as Calvin was talking about in his presentation, we're trying to figure out 10,000 ways to keep an intruder from entering our organization. All they got to do is find one. Okay, so you got to be diligent, persistence day in and day out. You got to keep a cybersecurity daily operational focus 24/7, 365 days a year, and 366 days a year on leap year. And you know, we can't practice advanced monitoring if we do not first practice the basics. And the reason why is that, let me move my screen over here. The reason why is because there's the average intruder, and I'm not talking about a script kiddie, I'm talking about an average intruder that's maybe trained to do this. They are members of organizations that are trying to attack our infrastructures and our networks. They're in our networks 291 days prior to launching attack. And that's because they're inside, they're footprinting, they're looking at what we're doing, they're observing our practices, they're observing our trends, and they're waiting because they know that they've got one shot at this. So what they're going to do is they're going to watch and observe and quietly just stay passive until the day of the attack. And then they're going to launch the attack because their deal is we want to get the mother load, so to speak, and we're going to get that large payload and then move away. So they're very sly in this objective. They sit in and they watch. And the sad part about it is that many of us have no ideas that they're in our network. One of the things that created a paradigm shift in my career, I remember years ago, and I'm going back in the 80s now. I was there at U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command, and I was the information assurance manager there. And a colonel came up to me, who was my boss, and he said, "Bob, can you?" And this was long before we have some of the sophisticated tools that we have today in monitoring, in the continuous monitoring techniques. And he would say, "Bob, can you assure me that no one's been in my network?" Well, that took me about 2 seconds to answer that because I didn't have a clue. But that put me on a passion for cybersecurity because I wanted to always be able to, from that day forward, if anybody asked me, "Bob, can you assure that nobody's been in my network?" I wanted to be able to answer that as honestly and as openly as I could, but also assure them, no one's been in our network. So that's what got me on really focusing on some of the controls that we put in place and some of the practices. But just to give you an idea, there's 1.3 billion security events per day, okay, that happens all across the internet and in our organizations. 80 command and control networks are taken down each month, and there's 178 million computers are compromised pretty much on a daily basis. And that's not trying to present a scare tactic. That is just some facts that are out there. And I think in the formal discussion, somebody, I think it was Calvin, said that computers are broken into like every 29 seconds or something like that. And he said he thought the computers were, or that number was extremely high. He thought the time was actually less. I totally agree because we found, and I'm going back again, back in the early 80s, late 90s, that as soon as we brought a system online, it was attempted to be attacked within 7 seconds once it was brought on. So that threat out there is very real. Okay, so the simple approach that we did in terms of our access controls is, and there's two parts, and I'm going to address more or less the user access, but there's another part of this as well, and that is your device access. So for the IT folks that are in the house, I would strongly recommend that you inventory your assets, keep them in a database, and keep that information current. So in other words, however many notebooks, desktops, iPads, smartphones, whatever that you're allowing to access your network, please make sure you've got those assets inventoried, you've got them in your a database of some sort, encrypted, protected, and then make sure you're keeping them current. So as you decommission systems or as you add new systems through your lifecycle replacement, that you make sure that you're keeping that inventory current, so you know exactly what you need to protect. Another thing that I used to do is when I would come into an organization and be in charge of their security, I would draw a diagram, and it was basically a replication of the network in its entirety. But it would be on a much smaller scale. But I kept that in a notebook. I knew exactly, like for example, in one organization, we had about 46 different sites of customers and how they were connected to us. So we would create our baseline strategy and the architecture on how we would allow them to access us. But then at that point, I would draw a very small replication of that network. For example, if I had 600 database servers, okay, I would put a database server in there, but I would explain on that chart what kind of database server it was, what we were using on it, the protocols, and so forth. Same with the file servers, mail servers, and so forth, our end user devices. And what I could happen is when a vulnerability raised its head in many different forms, whether it came through a US CERT, or whether it came forth from the vendor, or whether it came from our network scans, I knew exactly at a glance what kind of resources it was going to take to try to mitigate that vulnerability, how much it was going to cost, if I needed to bring on a different or to augment our staff with some additional help to do that. I knew at a glance how long it would take. But the basic thing that I found that a lot of companies weren't doing is certifying their devices and user accounts every 90 days. That was the policy that I had in place in every organization I went to. And to those of you that are familiar with DoD or the NIST special publications, I'm going to date myself because I'm going back to like 853, probably Rev 1 and 2. In those two special publications, NIST specifically said that they recommended that you certify your accounts every 90 days. Then I think from Rev 3 and on forward now into Rev 5, I think, they give that leadway to the institution, or to the institutional organization, and say it's an organizational requirement that basically the organization is to decide what is best for their organization in terms of certifying accounts. I disagree with that. I think you need to keep a hard, firm position on this, and 90 days is what you should be doing. And back to my formal statement, if an intruder is in your organization 291 days, I certainly rather at least find that out 80 days or 89 days from my last certification rather than going the 291 days. And let me tell you a quick story. When I first went to this one organization to take over as their quality assurance manager, which meant I was in charge of the application security for this particular application, it was day one. We were lighting up a new client in our finance and accounting. And for those of you that are familiar with the general accepted accounting principles and some of the federal regulations on accounting, you cannot have two accounting systems working at the same time. You have to close one down, start up a new one. And then you can always go back to the old accounting system to reconcile some transactions that could be that are still hanging out there. But you cannot have two active accounting systems. That's what we call cooking the books. Okay, so here's on day one. I'm green as a gourd, starting in on this organization. I remember going in there, and one of my security lead analysts come into my office, and this is day one. We're lighting up a new accounting system as well for a new client. And she comes into my office, she goes, Bob, she goes, we've got 60 users in our systems that are unauthorized. Man, I tell you, they almost had to get the paddles out, okay, and zap me back to life on that. I'm going like, what do you mean? And she goes, well, the way that we set this up, she says, we let the clients basically provide the access for their users in their organizations, and we provided the access for users in our organization. And I'm going, no, that cannot happen. I said, they're joining our network. We are responsible for the access to our network. We cannot have this divided security requirement. I said, we got to have one throat to choke, and that one throat to choke is me. And so as I explained further, I said, you tell them immediately to get user access controls in here for all these users, or are we going to basically disconnect all connections until we get those? Well, needless to say, it didn't make our security folks with our client base happy, but that was something that we had to do. So we did it. And then after we got all the user requests in, everything was good. My heart rate was back to about 72 beats a minute instead of 230. I called my staff in. I said, okay, ladies, because at that time, all my security analysts working for me were 12 analysts, 12 ladies. And I said, I want you to give me an example of when we should allow a user to access our system, particularly a finance and accounting system, without a user access request form. And I said, give me one incident. I said, for example, if they're emailing you a request, they can attach that request with it. If they're coming up to your desk, they can bring that request with them. If they're faxing a request, they can basically fax that request signed by their supervisor or manager when they come in. So I said, there's no reason that anybody should have an access, particularly to a finance and accounting system, without a user access request being signed by their supervisor or manager. And day one on the job, I implemented a very simple security policy: no access request, no access, and no exceptions. Didn't have to be a long written, drawn out policy. It was just very simple: no access request, no access, and there's no exceptions. And we put that into effect. And then lastly, when you're doing your access controls, you want to test those controls quarterly to ensure that they're operating effectively and operating as they are designed. In my mind, these are things that you have to do. If you don't do these principles and practices, you're setting yourself up for failure. So back to the on onboarding new employees, what you must do is all requests, particularly coming into a finance or any system that deals with money. Okay, they must be signed. They must be a formal request signed by a supervisor, and they can be written or digital, just as long as there's some forth of either a manual signature or a digital signature for that supervisor. You only assign the access that's commensurate with the duties of that particular employee. In other words, I know that a lot of times what we do is we just kind of put them in a group. If they're in the HR group, give them all the inherent privileges that comes with the HR. That should not happen. You should look at them, particularly on what they've been hired to do, and give them the least privilege and the least access that they need to do their job. Then you can increase that if you find out that they need more. Okay, no group inherent rights. And then if possible, invest in a governance risk or compliance tool, a GRC solution. Some of you that have small companies, small business, you say, Bob, I can't afford that. I totally get it, but I'm also telling you, you can still do it, because we operated for years off of a simple spreadsheet, just basically putting those duties in there, the separation of duties, where there was confliction, put them in there, and making sure that if a user got a user request, let's say, for example, it was an accounting system, and the supervisor comes in and says, well, I want to give Sarah, account payments privileges, and we would find out that Sarah had accounts receivable. We'd say, no, you can't do that, because there's a conflict of interest. There's a separation of duties. You cannot have both. You're gonna have to take one of those away from her. So you could do that with a manual spreadsheet just as well as if you can with an automated and a highly sophisticated government risk and compliance solution. And again, the simple policy that we used was no access, no access requests, no access, and no exceptions to that policy. The certification process. Here's where the root comes in on this. Number one, every 90 days, we would provide a list of users and their privileges to their directors, their branch chiefs, their division chiefs, and so forth, depending on how your organization was structured. Now, some people say, well, my gosh, Bob, that's a lot of work. No, it really isn't. If you give it to the highest level of your managers in that organization and let them basically delegate it down. As I used to tell them, I really don't care internally how you do it. I'm leaving it up to you, directors and division chiefs, on how you want to distribute that internally to your organization. But you do that and let them manage it the way that they want to. And then you give a solid suspense date, 2 weeks after they get it, or a month, whatever that situation may be. I wouldn't go too long though, but I would give them a solid suspense date. Mine was like 2 weeks. And then I would get an attestation or a certification statement from that division or branch chief, certifying or attesting to the accuracy of those accounts, their signature and their date. And the reason why I say this is because when someone attests or when someone certifies, there's legal implications that come with that. So in other words, it's more than just, oh yeah, Bob, no good, no worries, everybody's good. No, they need to certify or attest to that. And when they attest to that, if you have a rogue access or a rogue device, a rogue account, or somebody with elevated privileges that should not have them in your system, now you've got an audit trail that you can go back to and say, wait a minute, here on January 1st, you attested and you certified that all the users in your organization, number one, They were active users, they were authorized users. Their duties was assigned to them commensurate with their responsibilities, and there was no separation of duty conflicts. And so normally, again, as a note, I normally like to have the highest in the chain attest or certify to that process. So back to if you are using a GRC and you've got a able to afford that, number one, make sure it's set up in the prohibitive mode or restrictive mode or preventive mode, not in passive mode. To me, it made no sense to have a GRC if you're going to put it in passive mode. Put it in prohibitive mode based on the rules that you need for your particular discipline. And then under no circumstances do you change that. And then what we would do is we'd have the GRC running on its own, mirroring what was going on in that production environment. We didn't put it in as part of the production environment because then it would degrade performance, slow things down. We just had it mirroring attached to a switch or a port, watching all the traffic coming in and all the requests. So what we would do is we would run the access request through our GRC to validate that there was no separation of duty violations or escalation privileges before granting access. If we found that the GRC, and again, this was the rules that was put into the preventative mode based on the best accounting privileges and practices. Once we put that in, if we found that there was a separation of duty violation, we would just kick it back to the manager, say we can't do that because John has this privilege, he has this privilege. We can't do that. You got to take one of the two away. The user or manager would make the correction, resubmit the request. We'd run it through again to make sure that there was no conflict of interest, no separation of duty issues, and then permit the access. After we permitted the access, we would run a report again at the end of every week for all the new users or modification of accounts that we had conducted in that period, just to make sure that nothing slipped by us. And if there was, we would make the correction accordingly. Okay, on our departing employees, what we would do is we would, get the request that, okay, John's leaving the organization, he's got a promotion, going to a new company, whatever the situation may be, retiring, getting terminated. We'd make sure all accounts that he or she had access to was terminated at that time of the employee departure. Then we would also run, again, at the end of the week, a report to validate that we hadn't missed that John, if he left the company, did not have any orphan accounts or any access of any accounts that were still valid and active. And then at the end of the month, we would run a monthly report just as a check and balance again to ensure that there was no orphan accounts or any active accounts that an employee that had left the organization could still have access to and come back into, or an intruder could get those credentials and log back into our account. So that very quickly is kind of how we did it. It worked very effectively. I got a couple of stories I could share with you, but I'm looking at the time and I realize I'm at the end of my at least presentation time. So I will now open it up for any questions that you all may have.
Thank you so much, Bob, for your presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to post your post your questions in the chat, and Bob will be able to answer those questions. I think you did have a couple to come in.
Okay, let me look at this, okay.
When I was asking throughout my organization, 10 out of 1 people told me to just go certifications over a degree, made it a tough decision. Do you think that kind of outlook causes organizations to have too many qualified people that are not quite as qualified as they expect, or vice versa?
That very good question. I'll give you an example, and I'm not to knock certifications, but I remember years ago when I was a young man, if you can say, gosh, Bob, how back can you remember? But I remember going to Raleigh, North Carolina, and I was attending a course on firewall administration. And when you go to one of these technical schools, when they give you a break, you go down to the break room, snack machine, you get in your coffee. There was one of the employees that was there at that particular training institution, and she was very frustrated. And back in those days, the buzzword was Microsoft Certified Engineer. What is it? MSCE. I'm a Microsoft certified engineer. That was one of the buzzwords at that time, one of the buzz certifications. And she had come back from an interview and she was talking to one of her colleagues. And I'll never forget, she said, you know, all during the interview process, the potential hiring manager kept asking me, how many certifications do you have? Do you have a Microsoft certified engineer certification? And she goes, no, I do not, but I have 10 years experience and I have my master's in information systems. And she says, he just could not get past that. And I remember I filed that back mentally. And so when I became a manager, one of the things that I always did was I would look at the person who had experience, a good general all knowledge about cybersecurity or information security. And then I would hire that individual and then I would send them off to get a certification at the cost of our company or the cost of our organization. So I'm afraid that a lot of times, if you focus too much on one way or the other, you're going to get tunnel vision and you're going to have people that are, yeah, they're great. They got all these certifications and they're great technically, but they don't see the bigger picture of the organization, of its mission. And they don't maybe have some of the soft skills that they need. And then if you go the educational route, so to speak, or they may lack in some of the technical skills. So I like a balance of both. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I guess what I would do is I would hire somebody first based on their experience and their proven capability of what they've been able to accomplish over the years. And then I can always get them certified in specific certifications to maybe a particular need that I need focused in cybersecurity. Does that help? Okay, any other questions?
Chris, if Bob answered your question, you know, or if he didn't, feel free to unmute yourself. Let's see, what will be workload impact of accomplishing all the account checks and verifications frequently?
You know, thank you. That's a very good question. That comes up a lot. I know that what I've described probably sounds as a lot, but it really isn't. Like I said before, when I was in smaller organizations, we did this off of spreadsheets. And I had as many as, you know, there was a lot of times there were just 3 of us that was doing the security of the organization. And we would just basically, a user request come in, even if it was a manual process, we'd look at the request, look at our spreadsheet put together by subject matter experts in that particular discipline, be it accounting, be it HR, be it finance, whatever the discipline may be, and just determine on what accesses he or she had, look at the system, determine if there was any conflicts, and if not, go ahead and give the access. But the main thing, you know, is you have to do that check. And then when you submit that user account certification, when you're doing that every 90 days, it really is not that big a deal if you break it down into manageable pieces. In other words, let that division chief send it down to his or her branch chiefs, and the branch chiefs send it down to his or her section chiefs. It becomes very manageable at that point. And then all they do is they go back, they look at their accounts. Maybe they've only got 5 or 6 people in their organization. They look and make sure, okay, yep, there's no rogue accounts in here. We don't see any user accounts that, in other words, John is still with the organization, Sharon's still with the organization. They have the right roles and privileges assigned to their missions. And then they feed that back up to the chain. And then the director simply, he or she would sign in, date, and attest. I certify that all of our accounts are accurate and the duties are commensurate, or the privileges are commensurate with the duties that they have. If they come back and they would say, we did find some anomalies here, we've got a couple of users that do have some separation of duty issues, or there's an orphan account, we would make the correction, send them back a new user ID list, and then they would perform that all over again. Very simple process, and it really doesn't take a lot of time as long as you delegate that down. Does that help?
All right. What
other
are the risks? I'm sorry. What are the risk factors affecting vulnerabilities and countermeasures of an organization with minimal threat to the value of an organization?
What are the threats for the vulnerabilities that have minimal threat to the?
What are the risk factors affecting vulnerabilities and countermeasures of an organization with minimal threat to the value of an organization?
Well, what I would suggest is, and let me answer it this way. My policy when I was a CISO was, if there was a high level threat, in other words, if we got notified that there was a critical, and I never separated critical versus high. To me, they were one and the same. So if there was a high level threat, my policy was we need to mitigate that threat. If it's truly a high risk factor, we need to mitigate that threat within 5 working days, because we could be literally targeted or compromised before, you know, the day's end. Now, what we would do is we would take into compensating controls, and this is where it gets a little tricky, is because when somebody comes out, particularly cybersecurity professionals, we're guilty of this. We always have the sky is falling, and that's not always the case. You need to look at, is it an outward facing device? Is it protected by a layered security of firewalls, IDSs, IPSs, and other things, network monitoring tools, to determine, is it really a high threat, or do the compensating controls that we have in place bring those down? And for the medium risk, my policy was 15 days. Let's get this thing mitigated within 15 days. And then low level risk, 30 days. And to your point, sir or ma'am, in actuality, you know, once you start working those low level risks, you never get them completely done, because by the time you start working on the low level risk, another high level or moderate risk will come up, and you need to address it. My word of caution is this, though. Even if you've got low level threats, low level risk, the combination of those low level risks can escalate your posture to where you are now a medium or moderate risk to the organization. So I would suggest that you look at those low level threats, those low level risks, those low level vulnerabilities, and make sure you don't have too many of those, because if you do, you might find out that your risk posture has changed. Does that help?
Okay, and I think I don't see any additional questions. So Bob, thank you so much for your presentation today. A lot of great and insightful information for our participants. Again, thank you everyone for participating in our February CAE forum. Please feel free to check out the recording on our CAE community website. And also, we have our monthly Tech Talk on February 17th coming up. That will be again at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The link to join is on our CAE community website. And again, thank you so much for participating. Have a great day. Thank you again, Bob and Dr. Nobles.
Thank you.